I don't belong here. That's what I told myself on my first night at Ridgeway Psychiatric Facility. It didn't matter that I had checked in voluntarily or that the doctor assured me this was just a temporary stay. I wasn't like the others. I wasn't crazy. I had just broken. It started with the insomnia. A week without sleep, then 2. My thoughts tangled, my body ached, and suddenly I wasn't in control anymore. I lost my job after showing up at the office in a daze, unable to remember how I got there. I barely ate. My family found me sitting in my apartment, unresponsive, surrounded by stacks of untouched food. That was enough for them to drag me here. Just for a little while, they said. Just until I got better. I knew they meant well, but a place like this, it changes you. There were 6 of us in my ward. Some barely spoke, some never shut up. And some were worse. First, there was Raymond. He used to be an accountant until he stabbed his business partner in the throat with a letter opener. Now he spent his days pacing in tight circles, muttering about numbers, stopping only to snap his head toward people as if they had said something to him. I made the mistake of looking him in the eye on my second day. "You hear them too, don't you?" he whispered. "The whispers in the walls?" I shook my head. No. He leaned in. His breath smelled like sour milk. "You will." Then there was Molly. She was young, couldn't have been older than 20, but her arms were lined with scars that told a longer story. She had the habit of sitting too close, staring at people until they acknowledged her. At night, I'd wake up to find her standing in the hallway outside my room, her silhouette still and silent. When I confronted her about it, she only smiled. "You talk in your sleep," she said. There was one patient none of us spoke to, Ellis. He was in his 40s, gaunt and sunken-eyed, with a past that no one wanted to know. He spent most of his time sitting in the day room, staring at the old television that was never turned on. The staff kept a close watch on him, but he never acted out. Not in front of them, anyway. One night, I woke up to find him in my doorway. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, watching. I didn't sleep again until morning. Days blended together in Ridgeway. We woke up, we ate, we sat through therapy sessions, we took our meds. The nurses kept their distance unless they had to intervene. There was a quiet understanding between staff and patients. They wouldn't pry if we didn't give them a reason to. Group therapy was the worst. Sitting in a circle, sharing our progress, while Dr. Patel scribbled notes behind wire-framed glasses. "You haven't spoken much, Daniel," he said one afternoon. "There's nothing to say. You checked yourself in. That means you believe you need help." I glanced at the others. Molly was drawing invisible patterns on her thigh. Raymond was staring at the ceiling, lips moving soundlessly. Ellis, for once, was looking directly at me. I shifted uncomfortably. "I don't belong here," Ellis smiled. Just a little. That was the moment I knew I was lying to myself. It was the night shift nurse, Clara, who found Raymond. His door was cracked open, and inside he was standing on his bed, pressing his ear against the ceiling. "They're in there," he said when she asked what he was doing. Clara tried to coax him down, but Raymond wasn't listening. He clawed at the plaster above him, fingernails tearing at the paint. Then, with a sudden movement, he bit down on his own hand. Hard. It took 2 orderlies to drag him out, his mouth smeared red. They moved him to the high-security wing. His room stayed empty after that. A few days later, Molly started sitting next to me during meals. She'd push her food around her tray, never eating much. "You should be careful," she said one morning. I raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" She glanced around, then leaned in. "Ellis." Followed her gaze. Ellis sat alone at his usual table, staring at a dog-eared book in his lap. He never turned the pages. "He doesn't read," Molly whispered. "He just pretends." It sounded ridiculous, but once I started watching, I realized she was right. He always held the book, always had his eyes fixed on it, but he never actually turned a page. I asked the nurse about his file. She shook her head. Confidential. That night, when I passed the day room, I glanced inside. Ellis wasn't looking at his book. He was looking at me. I woke up to the sound of shuffling outside my room. My first thought was Molly. She had a habit of wandering at night. But when I sat up, I saw something worse. My door was open. Ellis stood at the foot of my bed. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked. His voice was calm, even. I didn't move. "Because I needed help." He tilted his head. "No, you're here because they put you here." I swallowed hard. Same as you. A small smile crept across his lips. Not the same. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on my nightstand, then turned and walked away. I waited until I was sure he was gone before unfolding it. It was a single page torn from his book, blank. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I kept the page tucked under my mattress and counted the days. 3 weeks later, Dr. Patel called me into his office. "You've made progress," he said. "I think you're ready to leave." I wanted to be relieved. Instead, I thought about Raymond, locked away. I thought about Molly, still wandering the halls. I thought about Ellis. As I packed my things, I glanced at the empty bed across from mine. The nurse at the front desk handed me my discharge papers. I hesitated. "Ellis," I said. "What's his diagnosis?" She frowned. "Ellis?" I nodded. Her expression didn't change. "We don't have a patient by that name." I wanted to argue, but my throat closed up. I took the papers, stepped through the front doors, and didn't look back. I spent weeks trying to rationalize it. Maybe Ellis had been transferred. Maybe the nurse just didn't know his name. Maybe the blank page meant nothing. But I still have it. And some nights when I can't sleep, I think about Ridgeway. About the ones who never left. And I wonder if I was ever meant to. I never thought I'd be working in a psychiatric facility. I had been a security guard at St. Vincent's Hospital for years, handling the usual trouble with unruly patients, thefts, and sometimes the occasional violent outbursts. But when they laid off most of the staff due to budget cuts, I found myself assigned to Brookhaven Psychiatric Facility, working the graveyard shift. The agency had promised it would be similar to the hospital work I was used to. In a way, it was, but I quickly learned there were a lot more things to be afraid of than just loud, aggressive patients. Brookhaven wasn't much different from the hospitals I'd worked in before. It was old, creaky floors, flickering lights, and a coldness that never really went away. The building had an unsettling quietness, and the staff always seemed like they were walking on eggshells. There were murmurs among the nurses, some tension in their voices when they spoke to the patients. "You'll mostly be walking rounds," my supervisor Phil said on my first night. "Checking doors, making sure patients are in their rooms, that sort of thing. Don't try to engage unless you have to. If you see something off, report it to the staff." I nodded and set off to my first round. It seemed simple enough, but the first night was a blur of strange occurrences. One of the first patients I encountered was a man named John, a late 40s type with a beard and tired eyes. He was always calm, sitting quietly in the day room, not really participating in any of the group activities. He barely spoke to the staff or the other patients. I was told by one of the nurses that he had been admitted after a breakdown following the sudden death of his wife. He had a history of depression and had been in and out of psychiatric wards for years. One night, I noticed him staring at the wall, his gaze fixed like he hadn't blinked in hours. He wasn't responding when I walked by, so I let it go. But later I saw him in the same position again, still staring, barely moving. The odd part was the way he seemed so perfectly still. He looked as though he was frozen in place, like the world around him didn't exist. I passed by a few more times over the next few hours, but each time his expression hadn't changed. I decided to go check on him. I approached him slowly, not wanting to startle him. "John?" No response. I tapped his shoulder lightly. That got his attention. He turned his head slowly toward me and blinked. "You all right?" I asked. His eyes were vacant. "I'm just waiting for her to come back," he said, almost in a whisper. "Who?" He just shook his head, looking at the floor. I moved on, feeling more uneasy than I had in a long time. A couple of nights later, things took a darker turn. I had just completed my rounds when I heard shouting from one of the rooms. I rushed over to see what was happening, and when I got to the door, I could see a patient named Sarah, a young woman in her mid-20s, struggling with one of the nurses. Sarah had been admitted after a suicide attempt. She had been through a lot of trauma, and although she was making progress, her emotions were always unpredictable. She was on the floor, her hands gripping the nurse's uniform, yelling incoherently. No, I can't go back. Please, don't take me back to that room." Her voice was filled with panic. I rushed in, asking what was going on, and one of the nurses explained that Sarah had been having a breakdown. Apparently, Sarah had been trying to make sense of everything that had happened in her life, and sometimes she couldn't differentiate between reality and her own fears. I stayed close, standing by the door, ready to call for more help if necessary. Eventually, she calmed down, and they helped her back to her room. I was told that Sarah's episodes were common, though nothing had ever escalated to violence before. But that night, I realized how fragile the patients at Brookhaven were. They weren't just struggling with their mental health. They were fighting against deep, painful memories and fears that, at times, seemed more real than the walls around them. Then there was Mr. Grayson, an older man in his 60s who had been a patient at Brookhaven for years. He had a long history of paranoia and delusions. He would often tell the nurses about people who were out to get him, even when no one was around. One night, while doing my rounds, I passed by his room. His door was cracked open, and I could hear him talking to himself in low, hurried tones. I pushed it open slightly, just enough to check on him. Mr. Grayson was sitting on the floor, facing the corner. He wasn't looking at the wall. He was staring at something I couldn't see. "I know you're watching," he muttered. "You think I don't see you, but I know you're out there." I paused, unsure of what to do. It wasn't uncommon for patients to talk to themselves, but there was something unsettling about the way Mr. Grayson spoke. I knocked softly on the door frame. "Mr. Grayson?" He stopped talking. Slowly, he turned his head, and I could see that eerie, unnerving smile on his face. "I'm not crazy," he said, his voice quiet and matter-of-fact. "You don't believe me, but I'm not." Before I could say anything, he turned away from me again, muttering under his breath. I left quickly, feeling the chill of his words linger in the air. The most disturbing night came a month after I started working at Brookhaven. I was doing my usual rounds when I found one of the newer patients, Lindsay, attempting to hang herself in her room. The sight was horrifying. Her bed sheets were tied around the top of the doorframe, and she had already started to lose consciousness. I reacted immediately, rushing in and cutting the sheets before calling for medical staff. The nurses arrived just in time to help, but it was too close. She was lucky to survive. Lindsay had been struggling with severe depression and had been kept under strict observation, but she had found a way to slip through the cracks. The guilt of that night haunted me for weeks. It felt like I should have seen the signs. After that incident, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't cut out for this kind of work. The tension in the air, the constant emotional turmoil of the patients, it was too much. It wasn't the security job I had signed up for. I ended up requesting a transfer. The agency understood. They moved me back to a regular hospital, away from the weight of the psychiatric ward. The work was calmer, more predictable. But to this day, I can't forget the people I met at Brookhaven. Their stories, their pain. Some of them made it through, others didn't, and I'm still haunted by the fact that I could never truly understand what they were going through. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. It's been 3 years since I left West Haven's psychiatric facility. I'm fine now. I have a job, an apartment, and a normal routine. Most days I don't even think about my time there. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I remember. I wasn't sent to West Haven for a breakdown. It was more complicated than that. Let's just say I made some bad decisions, and a judge decided I needed treatment instead of a prison cell. At the time, I hated the idea. I thought I'd be locked up with a bunch of lunatics. But after a few weeks, I realized most of the patients were just like me, people who had lost their way. Most of them. Then there was Matthew. Matthew was in his 20s, thin, with a head of dark, greasy hair that he constantly pushed back. He didn't talk much during the day, just sat in the day room, flipping through old magazines, staring at the same pages for hours. The staff said he had dissociative episodes, meaning sometimes he'd just zone out completely, like he wasn't even there. But at night, he moved. I first noticed it a few days after I arrived. My room was at the end of the hallway, and from my bed, I could see through the small window in my door. One night, I woke up and saw someone standing outside. It was Matthew. He was barefoot, wearing the standard gray sweatpants and t-shirt we all had, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something. Then he took a step, slowly dragging his foot forward. Another step. He wasn't walking normally. He was gliding, like something was pulling him. I sat up, watching as he disappeared down the hallway. The next morning at breakfast, I mentioned it to another patient, Daniel. "Yeah," he said, stabbing at his eggs. "He does that. Been sleepwalking since he got here." "They don't do anything about it?" Daniel shrugged. "He never gets far. Nurses always bring him back." That should have been the end of it. Just another weird quirk in a place full of them. But then things got worse. It was maybe a week later when I woke up to a sound in my room. Breathing. Not mine, someone else's. I turned my head, and in the dim glow from the hallway lights, I saw him. Matthew was standing at the foot of my bed, his head slightly tilted, his lips moving silently. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I just watched as his mouth formed words with no sound. His fingers twitched at his sides. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and walked out. I sat there, heart hammering, listening as his footsteps faded down the hall. The next morning, I told the nurses. They just nodded like it was normal. "He doesn't mean any harm," one of them said. "He's never hurt anyone." "That's not the point," I said. "He was in my room. We'll keep an eye on him." They didn't. Or if they did, it wasn't enough. Because the next time, he did more than just stand there. The whisper. 2 nights later, I woke up again. But this time, he wasn't standing at the foot of my bed. He was sitting on the floor. His back was against my nightstand, his legs folded up against his chest. His eyes were half closed, but his mouth was moving again, whispering something under his breath. I swallowed hard. "Matthew?" He didn't react. I leaned forward. "Hey, you're in my room." Nothing. Then, just as I was about to call for help, he spoke. Not to me, to someone else. "She's not gone," he murmured. "She's still here." A chill ran through me. I pressed the call button by my bed. A minute later, a nurse came in, flicking on the light. Matthew didn't even flinch. "Oh, Matthew," the nurse sighed. "Come on, let's go." She helped him up, guiding him out of my room. Before he stepped into the hallway, he turned his head slightly and whispered one more thing. "You'll see." By this point, I wasn't sleeping much. Every little noise in the hall made me sit up, expecting to see Matthew in my doorway again. But the next few nights were quiet. I started to convince myself that maybe it was over. Then, one final time, he came back. I woke up to the feeling of something touching my face. My eyes flew open, and there he was. Matthew was standing right next to my bed, his fingers grazing my cheek. I jerked away, pressing myself against the wall. "Matthew, get out." His hand dropped to his side. He blinked slowly, like he was just waking up. Then he leaned in and whispered, "She's in here with you." That was it. I shoved him hard. He stumbled back, blinking rapidly, and for the first time, he looked confused. The noise must have alerted the staff because seconds later, 2 nurses rushed in. Pulled him out of my room as he mumbled something under his breath. I barely slept after that. 2 days later, I was transferred to a different ward. A few months after that, I was released. I didn't ask what happened to Matthew. I didn't want to know. Now, 3 years later, I tell myself it was just sleepwalking. Just a disturbed man with an unconscious habit. That's what makes sense. That's the logical answer. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear his whisper. And for a split second, I'm afraid to open my eyes.